Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and there are many different types of binding. We have a bias binding, binding that's cut on the length of the fabric and on the width of the fabric. We have a double fold binding and a single fold binding. So today, let's cover the most common, which is a binding cut on the width of the fabric, and it's called a double fold. A double fold binding is when the fabric is folded in half, and when it's put on the quilt, all the raw edges are stitched together, and when it's folded over and stitched down along this one edge is a double fabric. So there's two layers of fabric, and that is a double fold binding, and they're very easy to make. We're going to cut the strips from the width of fabric, which means it's going from the selvage around to the selvage. And the strips are going to be cut along the width of this fabric. The first thing, and it is a very important thing, is to make sure our fabric is pressed first. I even like to press out that center fold. Having the fabric pressed well first is going to make sure that the cuts are accurate. Once it's pressed, we can match up those selvage edges. And for this fold, I just gently fold it with my hand. By ironing out that original fold, it gives me a chance to make sure that the fabric is straight, because that fold will really dictate where you're going to fold your fabric. And by having that pressed out, I can fold it more accurately. From here, I'm going to cut those strips. But we do need to straighten up our one edge. And I do like to use a double ruler technique, which means I'm using two rulers. The one ruler, and I like to take the largest ruler, and I line it right up against that fold that I hand pressed. Just take one of those lines and line it up along the fold. It is important that that fold is right along a straight line on the ruler. Once that fold is straightened up, we're going to be able to trim off this extra. If you're left-handed, you're going to trim off that right side. But since I'm right-handed, I'm going to be trimming off the left-hand side. Once I have the one ruler squared up, I'm going to place that second ruler right along that edge. Make sure that those rulers are touching. Give a second check and make sure the ruler has not shifted. And then that first ruler can be just moved slightly. You don't even need to move it a lot. Having it stay there will actually help the fabric not move for this very first cut. Now I'm going to use the edge of the second ruler to trim it off. Once that piece has been trimmed off, I have that perfect angle to start cutting my pieces. From here, we only need one ruler. The most common bindings are cut 2 inches to 2.5 inches. I personally find 2 inches just a little bit too small, but 2.5 inches is a little bit too big. So I like to cut my binding at 2.25 inches. So I do have the measurement at 2.25 inches right along that cut edge. And double check and make sure that fold is still on a straight line. Now we're going to be able to cut the first row of binding. Start a little bit off the fabric, and we want to cut and move our hands as we go along. I'm going to cut a little bit, leave the rotary cutter in place, move your hand, and you can do that as many times as you need to in order to cut without the ruler moving out of place. I try not to move the main body of the fabric, so I'll move the binding instead. From there I can cut my next strip. I'm going to make sure I have that 2.25 inch mark, or whatever mark you like your binding at. I check and make sure that that fold is still on a straight line, and I can cut my next strip. Next strip done. And you can continue cutting as many strips as you need. Once I have my strips of binding cut, I'm going to be able to bring them to the machine and sew them. And I do like to sew them together before I trim off my selvages. I stack that pile one on top of another. And that way I can bring this whole stack to the machine. And they're all in the same order, the folds all in the same area, and the selvages are all together. When I'm sitting at the machine, I like to take the fabric, lay the entire stack on my lap. On my right-hand side, I have the selvage. On the left-hand side, I have the fold. This just gives me a way to chain piece without having to remember the direction of all the fabric. Now I can sit at my machine and sew these all together without measuring and without cutting these ends. So those strips are right on my lap. I pick up the first piece, open it up so that I have a single layer with the top of the fabric facing up. Pick up the second piece, and I'm going to put this top piece on top of the second top piece. So it's just a matter of crossing that fabric over. And this could be moved out of the way. I want the fabric sitting together and that selvage is hanging out on each edge. And I need a straight line on all four corners. You can just eyeball it to see if it's straight. If not, you can use a little ruler and make sure that you have a straight edge. I'm going to start with the sewing machine needle right there in that corner. And I'm going to stitch all the way down, coming off of this corner. And you can draw a line to do that. The fabric is straight on one edge, and this is on the perfect angle. You can check that with a ruler. And then we're going to stitch from point, coming right off to this point. My needle is down, and I'm going to slide that fabric right into that point. Put the foot down and sew right along that line, coming off at this point. I do not trim the thread. I just pull a little bit out so that I have a bit of a space. Find the end to that top and place it on top of your machine bed with the right side of the fabric facing up. I have that next piece still on my lap, and on my right hand side I can grab that selvage edge and place it on top. It won't matter how many pieces I'm going to sew. This top piece of fabric is going to be the next end that I'm going to stitch on. Right side of the fabric up, pick up the selvage from your lap on your right hand side and cross it over. Make sure your edges are straight and stitch from corner to corner. And you can always draw that line sitting right here at the machine. If you do feel like you need to pin it, you can pin the top corner just to hold those layers together. My machine needle is down. I can now just pick this up and slide it right to that intersection. Everything is out of the way and I can start stitching following that line. And come right off that corner. Leave yourself some thread and do your next piece with that 45-degree angle. When we open it up, the edges match. Right here at the machine, I do like to trim it. And I don't measure, but I do leave more than a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And trim off right to that corner. I will then go to the iron and press all of these open and flat. If you press them to one side, you have an extra layer of fabric along the one seam. So you'll have more of a bump when you do go to sew this on. So by pressing it open, it evens out that seam. When those seams are stitched on the diagonal, when that binding is folded in half, right sides together, you can see where very little of the fabric overlaps. So this is going to be a very smooth finish. If you need to do a seam that's right across, when you fold that over, all of that fabric is going to stack on top of each other. You will have a lot of fabric in this one area. Having that seam sewn on the angle, so that angle is going to give us a smoother binding. However we do the seams, it's important just to press those seams open. To finish this binding and get it ready for the quilt, we need to do a second pressing. After we press our seams flat, we're going to match up the raw edges so that the wrong side is inside and do a light pressing and press that entire long strip. Once it's all pressed, I like to roll it up to store it, and I use a ruler. And I'm just going to roll that loosely on the ruler. If it's not too tight, it comes off easily. And this is now very easy to bring to the machine and sew the binding on the quilt. Your binding is nice, neat, and tidy, ready for when the quilt needs to be bound. The 3 common measurements for a binding are 2.5 inches, and this has been folded in half, 2 1/4, it's been folded in half, and 2 folded in half. All 3 sizes are stitched with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. What you really will notice is the back side, not the front side. Each of these will be turned over and stitched onto the back. The front will still equal that 1/4 inch because that binding is folded right along that cut edge. But when you turn it over, that's when you notice the difference. We have the 2 inch, 2 1/4, and the 2 1/2. And I have pressed these and have pulled them really tight along that edge so you can see the difference. Usually you leave just a little bit of space. You don't need it really, really tight. But there's the difference between 2 1/2 inches and 2 inches. So cutting that width of fabric really is a personal preference. It's going to look the same from the front. It's how much do you want to work with along the back. And having all of those strips pre-cut and having them lay on your lap when you get to the sewing machine. You do not have to cut off the selvages in advance. You do not need to cut the angles in advance. You're just going to pick up each layer and sew those ends together. Trim, press, press in half, and we have our double fold with the fabric binding done. There are many ways we can make binding, and that is my personal favorite. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.